For more than 500 years, the story of King Richard III has been surrounded by mystery, controversy, and legend. He was remembered as the last English king to die in battle, and for centuries historians debated his character and his right to the throne. But in recent years, a modern tool, DNA testing, has reopened the case of this long-dead monarch in ways no one could have imagined. When scientists discovered his remains buried under a parking lot in Leicester, England, they thought they were simply confirming an identity. Instead, they found evidence that might rewrite the royal family tree of England itself. The DNA results did more than prove who Richard was. They raised questions about who his father really was. Was Richard III truly a direct descendant of the powerful King Edward III, as the official royal records claimed? Or had a secret affair somewhere in his family line broken the chain of royal blood? This question would turn what began as an archaeological discovery into one of the biggest historical mysteries ever solved by science. In 2012, a team of archaeologists working in Leicester made a discovery that shocked the world. Under layers of asphalt and gravel in a city parking lot, they uncovered human bones twisted in a shallow grave. The skeleton had a curved spine and signs of brutal battle wounds, features that matched centuries-old descriptions of King Richard III. For more than 500 years, people had believed his body was lost forever after his defeat at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. According to old stories, his remains were thrown into a river and forgotten. Yet here he was, beneath a modern city street, waiting to be found. The discovery was not part of a grand royal project or a massive excavation. It began as a small research mission, led by historians who used old maps to locate the site of a medieval church where Richard was rumored to have been buried. When they found the remains, every detail, from the curved spine to the injuries on the skull, told the same story. This was England's lost king, lying quietly beneath a parking lot for half a millennium. After the discovery, scientists carefully moved the bones to a laboratory at the University of Leicester. Their goal was simple: to use DNA testing to prove that the skeleton really belonged to Richard III. They started with mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from mothers to their children and remains mostly unchanged over generations. This type of DNA is often used in ancient studies because it can survive for hundreds of years. The researchers searched for living relatives from Richard's maternal family line and eventually found people who were descended from his sister, Anne of York. When they compared their DNA to the samples taken from the bones, the match was perfect. The chances of that happening by accident were almost impossible. The scientists could now confidently say that the remains were indeed those of Richard III. This was an incredible moment for history and science. A forgotten king, found and confirmed through modern genetics. Yet this was only the beginning of the story. The DNA didn't just tell them who Richard was. It held clues about his family line that would soon shake the foundations of England's royal history. To understand the next part of the mystery, we have to go back to Richard's family tree. His royal bloodline came from Edward III, one of England's greatest medieval kings. Edward III's sons founded the two rival branches of the royal family, the Lancasters and the Yorks. Richard III was part of the House of York, and his right to rule depended entirely on being a direct male-line descendant of Edward III. In the 1400s, royal blood was more than family pride. It was a claim to power. Every war, every rebellion, and every royal marriage was shaped by who could prove their ancestry. The Wars of the Roses, the brutal civil wars between the Yorks and Lancasters, were fought over this very question of bloodline. So, when scientists began to test Richard's DNA for a match with other descendants of Edward III, they were not just checking family history. They were testing the very foundation of royal legitimacy. The idea that every king was born from an unbroken chain of royal fathers stretching back for centuries. The next step was to study Richard's Y chromosome, the part of DNA passed only from father to son. If Richard was truly descended from Edward III through the male line, his Y chromosome should match that of living male-line descendants of Edward III. These modern men were members of noble families, like the Dukes of Beaufort, who traced their ancestry through John of Gaunt, another son of Edward III. The test was complicated and time-consuming. It required careful comparison of DNA from centuries-old bones and living people, with full attention to historical records and family trees. Scientists expected the results to confirm what history had always said, that Richard's male lineage was pure and unbroken. But when the final numbers came in, they showed something no one expected. Richard III's Y chromosome did not match that of Edward III's descendants. Somewhere in the chain between Edward and Richard, there had been a break, a case where a recorded father was not the biological one. In other words, somewhere in the royal family, a secret affair had changed the bloodline of kings. This revelation was like a bomb dropped into English history. For centuries, the royal family's legitimacy rested on its unbroken male descent from Edward III. The discovery suggested that, at some point, one of the kings or princes might not have been the true biological son of his supposed father. The exact point where this happened is still a mystery. It could have occurred generations before Richard, or perhaps in a later branch of the family. The scientists were careful not to accuse any particular ancestor because there were many possibilities across the centuries. But the implications were enormous. If a false paternity had happened early enough in the family tree, it could mean that some later kings, even Henry VIII or Elizabeth I, might not have been true heirs to Edward III by blood. Of course, this doesn't change the course of history. They still ruled England, built empires, and left legacies. But it adds a fascinating new layer to the story, that the royal bloodline itself might not be as pure or as certain as everyone believed. Once the DNA results were published, historians began to play detective. They searched through old letters, marriage records, and political scandals from centuries past, trying to find where the break could have occurred. Some pointed to the generation between Edward III and his son, John of Gaunt. Others suggested it might have happened later between Richard's father, Richard of York, and his supposed grandfather. There were rumors that Cecily Neville, Richard's mother, had an affair while her husband was away at war. Whispers that her children might not all share the same father. At the time, such claims were dismissed as political propaganda, meant to weaken the York family's claim to the throne. But after the DNA discovery, those old rumors seemed less like gossip and more like possible clues. Still, the evidence remains purely circumstantial. Without testing more royal remains, something politically sensitive and logistically difficult. The exact truth may never be known. The case of Richard III became a perfect example of how science can transform our understanding of the past. Before this discovery, much of medieval history relied on documents, portraits, and legends, all of which could be biased or incomplete. But DNA told a story that could not be rewritten. It didn't care about royal pride or centuries of tradition. It simply revealed the truth hidden in Richard's bones. This case also showed how modern genetics could solve ancient mysteries. What started as an archaeological search under a parking lot turned into a global headline and a turning point for historical research. Universities, historians, and geneticists began to collaborate more closely than ever before, realizing that every skeleton and every grave might hold a forgotten secret. The discovery of Richard's remains wasn't just about one king. It symbolized how history and science could work together to uncover truths that even royal families never knew. When the discovery was announced, the public's reaction was a mix of excitement, curiosity, and disbelief. People from around the world followed the news as if a historical drama was unfolding in real time. The idea that a king's remains had been found beneath an ordinary parking lot fascinated millions. Crowds visited Leicester to see where history had literally been unearthed. The local museum built an entire exhibition dedicated to Richard III, displaying replicas of his bones, armor, and even a 3D facial reconstruction based on his skull. For many, seeing the reconstructed face of a man who lived over 500 years ago made the past suddenly feel alive. But the most emotional moment came when Richard's remains were reburied in Leicester Cathedral in 2015, in a grand ceremony attended by thousands. After centuries of being lost, the last Plantagenet king finally received the royal burial he had been denied in death. Before the discovery, Richard III's reputation was largely shaped by William Shakespeare's famous play, which portrayed him as a cruel, deformed villain who murdered his way to the throne. But the real Richard may have been far more complex. The scientific discovery of his remains and the analysis of his injuries, his diet, and even his DNA allowed historians to see him in a new light. The curved spine confirmed his physical condition, but it didn't define his personality. The careful burial showed he was treated with some respect, even in defeat. And the genetic study gave him something even greater, a new kind of immortality. Through DNA, Richard III became the first historical monarch whose identity and family secrets were proven by modern science. His rediscovery not only solved a mystery, but also changed how we see the distant past, not as a frozen legend, but as a story still evolving with every new discovery, even with all the excitement. Some historians and scientists warned that DNA evidence alone might not give the full picture. Ancient DNA can degrade over time, and even small contamination can cause misleading results. Some experts argued that the mismatch in the Y chromosome might not necessarily prove an affair. It could be the result of a distant, random mutation or a mistake in the recorded genealogy. Others pointed out that the historical record itself, written and copied over centuries, might contain errors. After all, medieval kings often used titles and claims to justify their rule, not strict biological evidence. Still, most experts agree that the DNA findings are strong, not absolute proof, but powerful evidence that something unusual happened in the royal family line. The debate continues, showing that science and history often work hand in hand and sometimes challenge each other. Beyond the royal intrigue and politics, there's something deeply human about this discovery. For centuries, Richard III was remembered as a monster, a symbol of ambition and cruelty. But science revealed him as a person. His bones showed signs of pain and injury, his diet reflected privilege, and his final wounds told the story of a desperate fight for survival. The curved spine that once inspired mockery became a mark of humanity, not evil. When people looked at his reconstructed face, they didn't see a villain. They saw a man of his time, flawed and real. The story also reminded the world that even the most powerful figures in history were still human beings, subject to the same emotions, mistakes, and secrets as everyone else. The fact that DNA is something we all share, could bridge 5 centuries of history, made this story even more moving. Since Richard's rediscovery, the story has inspired countless books, documentaries, and discussions. Universities have created new courses that blend archaeology, genetics, and history. Even school children have learned how science can bring history to life. Tourists continue to visit Leicester to see the king's tomb, turning the city into a place where the medieval and modern worlds meet. Every year, new studies are published on his remains, from isotopic analysis that reveals what he ate to forensic studies that reconstruct how he died in battle. The search for truth continues, not just about Richard himself, but about the world he lived in. And each discovery, no matter how small, adds another piece to the puzzle of who he really was. So what does this mean for England's royal history? In practical terms, nothing changes. Today's monarchy still stands, and no one is suggesting their place on the throne is invalid. But in a symbolic way, it means everything. The story of Richard III's DNA reminds us that royal bloodlines, like all family lines, are fragile, human, and sometimes flawed. They are not immune to secrets, mistakes, or hidden affairs. The idea of pure royal blood has always been more myth than fact. The DNA evidence simply confirms that history is made by people, not perfection. What began as a dig under a parking lot ended up showing that even the mightiest dynasties can carry human secrets deep within their genes. Science revealed not just who Richard was, but also who we are, a species defined not by our titles or crowns, but by our shared and imperfect humanity. Even after all these discoveries, the full truth about Richard III's paternal line remains a mystery. Scientists cannot yet say exactly where the break in the bloodline occurred or who was involved. More DNA testing of other royal remains might one day answer those questions. But such research requires permission from both the church and the crown, and it's not always granted. For now, the story of Richard III stands as both a solved and unsolved mystery, a king identified, but a family secret still waiting in the shadows of history. What we do know is that Richard's rediscovery changed the way the world sees the past. It connected science and storytelling in a way that made history come alive again. Perhaps one day new tests will reveal even more about the kings and queens who shaped England. Until then, the bones of Richard III remind us that truth has a way of surviving, even beneath 500 years of earth and stone.